Bohman with OCP North America, talking about issues related to the fertilizer product.
You got it.
Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Morning, everyone. For those of you that I haven't met before, I'm Brian Bohman. Sure, that works great. I'm with OCP North America. Did my PhD at University of Minnesota working with Carl Rosen and Dave Mola, mostly focusing on nitrogen, but today the topic is phosphorus, and that's what OCP focuses on. So I have a bit of a shorter talk. Hopefully we'll make it through all. If there's questions that we don't have time for, I'll be around all day, so please feel free to find me. We'll be talking a bit about the production of phosphate fertilizer, a review of key forms and sources of phosphate fertilizer, and then some agronomic considerations, more food for thought type things at the end. So as we dive into the production of phosphate fertilizer, I just want to give a bit of an overview of OCP and OCP North America. For those of you who aren't familiar with OCP, we're a phosphate fertilizer company based in Morocco. We have over 70% of the world's phosphorus reserves, and we see ourselves as a steward in everything that we do related to phosphorus. So we're really happy to be part of the discussion today and all the good work that growers in Minnesota and in the region are doing on nutrient management issues. When you think about the availability of phosphate reserves across the world, much of that is located in Morocco, but there's other key resource areas too. We're going to be talking a bit about mining, so I want to talk about the types of rocks that phosphorus is found in. There's two primary types: sedimentary phosphates. Those are the formed by marine sediments. Lower production cost, that's the type of rock that you have in Florida, for example, in addition to in Morocco. Those are the circles that you see on the map across the globe. And then the igneous phosphates. These are more expensive to mine and in lower abundance across the world. When we're mining for these sedimentary phosphates, I like these two pictures because you get to see, on the right, it's this replica showing the geological layers, how you're pulling out the phosphate-rich layers and removing the overburden or the waste rock layers. I was just in Morocco last week or 2 weeks ago and got to see one of these mines in person, and it's pretty impressive. The pictures don't really give a perspective of the scale, the expansiveness, and also just the scope of it. So it's pretty impressive, and because these are seabeds too, you're going to find things like marine fossils in the mines as well. So this is really accumulated phosphorus from sea life over millions of years, right? So it's a finite resource, and it's one that we need to manage and take care of carefully. The processing of this rock is a complex process. I'm not going to go into it in too much depth, mostly because it's not my area of expertise, and we want to focus on the fertilizers themselves. But I think what's important to think about is as the rock is taken or extracted out of the ground, there's various physical processes, washing and separating the rock, chemical processes, moving it from the mine to the processing plants, and it's bulk material, right? So making sure that as we can be as efficient as possible in both the extraction process and making sure that we're producing it and moving it through the supply chain and the production process in an economical way. We have a very large slurry pipeline that moves, this is just an OCP example, we have a very large slurry pipeline that moves the crushed rock from the mine all the way down to the plants and the ports where it's manufactured and shipped out across the world. And this rock it comes in various grades of phosphate content through the beneficiation process. That's the mechanical washing and extraction before the chemical process begins. You're going to end up with phosphate rock that has somewhere in the ballpark of 30% total P2O5. A very small amount of that is plant available. We'll talk more about phosphate rock as a fertilizer coming up. But going through various reactions with acid, sulfuric acid, phosphoric acid, removal of water or gypsum byproducts, that's what produces the fertilizer. We'll talk about each of these as an example, but all of this is derived from rock. And we'll get into a bit more depth in coming slides. I wanted to show this slide because we're going to be talking about different forms of phosphate fertilizer, some that we're probably more familiar with and some that we're probably less. I thought it was helpful to take a look at this historical data. This is on U.S. consumption of phosphates. You can see in the 60s and 70s, the primary sources of phosphate fertilizer were the superphosphates, TSP and simple superphosphate, SSP or OSP or NSP. It goes by all of those names. Those are simpler, fertilizers in a way. There was a dramatic rise in total production and use of phosphate fertilizers with the ammoniated phosphates, that technology, and that was just due to reductions in cost and complexity relative to superphosphates. And that's still the world that we live in. The ammoniated phosphates are still the primary source of phosphate fertilizers, both in the US and globally. So let's talk through some of the key phosphate fertilizers. Rock, like I mentioned, it's variable composition depending on where it comes from. There's going to be different qualities depending on the mine, whether it's igneous or sedimentary. But for the most part, these are all apatite-type minerals. I'm not a geologist, but I think what matters from that is that there's varying levels of impurities and phosphate content, and that has implications for how the rock can be used itself as a fertilizer, how available that P2O5 is, and also for downstream processing too. You know, what types of products can be produced from that phosphate rock. It can be used as a fertilizer. It qualifies as an organic fertilizer, but it has extremely low water solubility and needs to be applied in acidic soil conditions, pH less than 5.5. The P2O5 will be made available over time, but it's going to take a really long time, and if you're in high pH soils, it might never become available. The superphosphates, SSP and TSP. SSP was the first commercial mineral fertilizer. It's produced by reacting phosphate rock with sulfuric acid. So what you have in this granule is a combination of the phosphate, and then you also have gypsum in there too. So it has a significant sulfur content, 12%, right? There's varying levels of grades, and as this product was developed over, its lifetime, the P2O5 content increased from, say, 10%, now it's closer to 20% in the forms that are available. It's still used in some geographies. It's popular in Brazil. I think it's used somewhat in India too. It's not very common here because the improved or high analysis phosphate, TSP, it's a higher grade phosphate produced by reacting phosphate rock with phosphoric acid. And so you don't have that gypsum byproduct that's in the fertilizer itself. So it's just a straight nutrient. Both of these are acidic granules and have good water solubility. The ammoniated phosphates, these, in addition to the production characteristics, why they might be more favorable to fertilizer companies, they also have a high total analysis grade in the combination of nitrogen and P2O5, which makes them preferred. And they're going to have agronomically similar performance across the single ammonium and the diammonium version. There are some differences. We'll talk about that, especially as you think about high pH soils and making sure your P2O5 is available. But for the most part, you're going to have similar agronomic performance. The difference just being the ratio of nitrogen to P2O5 in the fertilizer. More common now are these sulfur-enhanced phosphates. So we talked about SSP, which was, in a sense, a sulfur-enhanced phosphate. It's not necessarily what we'd consider to be a sulfur-enhanced phosphate now. Going through processes of cogranulation, sulfur coating, or partial acidulation, you're able to add either elemental sulfur or sulfate sulfur, the two key sources of sulfur, to that fertilizer to have a single granule. This has become especially important as sulfur is becoming more of a limiting nutrient in certain environments, and so making sure that crops that have a high sulfur demand are able to get that delivered as part of the phosphate fertilizer. I should just mention the sulfate sulfur is the one that's immediately plant available. It's going to have similar dynamics like nitrate in the soil where it's mobile and can be leached away. That elemental is going to be slow released over months to years, depending on the granule size and the environmental conditions. And I should also mention too, there's a wide variety of these NPS, these sulfur-enhanced phosphates. The one that OCP manufacturers and sold is called TerraTech 10S. We also have a sulfur and zinc version, but these have become widely common in the market. Things like Mosaic's Micro Essentials would be a type of co-granulated sulfur-enhanced phosphate as well. And then the liquid fertilizers. We had some discussion in the last presentation about the use of 1034O at planting. Essentially, if you take phosphoric acid, you add ammonium and drive out water, you're going to get this stable fluid fertilizer, ammonium polyphosphate. There's a portion of it that's the orthophosphate. That's the portion that's plant available. The polyphosphate chains, which is multiple phosphates combined together, that's going to be made available over weeks. So it's a great starter fertilizer source because it's a fluid, it's a liquid, and it mixes and stores well. And I think we'll just breeze by this, but this is just a comparison, right? There's a lot of dimensions here in terms of picking the right tool, and sometimes the tool that you pick to apply your phosphate is just the one that you have available in your region. So let's talk through some agronomic considerations. We've done some historical data comparing superphosphates, in this case, TSP versus ammoniated phosphates, both MAP and DAP, and also comparing a sulfur-coated, elemental sulfur-coated TSP with a co-granulated sulfur-enhanced ammoniated phosphate. So we're going to look at some of this data. I'll give you the spoiler up top. We don't see differences in agronomic performance, but we'll dive into the data and see it. I guess the takeaway here is that in a lot of ways, a phosphate is a phosphate is a phosphate. There are differences. We'll get to that in the final slides, but that's just the message to keep in mind as we're walking through this data. In both of these studies, we are looking at a pre-plant spring broadcast incorporated. That's how we do most of our trials. And this is over a number of site years at P-responsive sites, so typically less than 15 or 20 parts per million. A lot of our data is, we use Malic 3 just because we're working across the US. And so say around, 15 or so parts per million Bray P1. So these are all responsive sites. When we see the response, so this was in 2020 across 9 site years in corn and 10 site years in soybean, we do see a response in corn to the application of phosphate fertilizer. No significant difference between the superphosphate and the ammoniated phosphate. And again, no significant difference between the sulfur-enhanced superphosphate and the ammoniated phosphate that's been sulfur-enhanced. And I should just mention these sites are in Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, South Dakota, and Nebraska, and that's pretty common across the 3 years of data that we're going to look at. A similar story in 2021, except this time we see that the soybean trials were responsive to P205, and the corn trials were very responsive to P205. And the story is the same. We don't see any significant differences between the superphosphate and the ammonium phosphate and the sulfur-enhanced fertilizers as well. I should mention too that for the most part, these are all acidic sites. Looks like there is one site that might be slightly alkaline in 2021. That's going to be an important thing to talk about too. I'll have a little discussion on how you can think about soil pH and phosphates in just a moment. And again, a similar story in 2022. This time we're just comparing TSP and MAP. And the takeaway is the same, that these sites were responsive to P205, and we didn't see a significant difference between TSP and ammoniated phosphates. So that's a good thing, right? This is a fertilizer that was common in the past. It's become less common, perhaps not for agronomic reasons exclusively. There are some things to keep in mind about superphosphates versus ammoniated phosphates, but part of the rise in the ammoniated phosphates relative to the superphosphates was just that's what was perhaps more economical to produce and to be made available. But we don't see when we're testing it again now in these neutral to acidic soil conditions, we don't see any meaningful agronomic differences in performance. So what are some additional agronomic considerations to keep in mind? Nitrogen losses. When ammoniated phosphates are applied in the fall, there is a potential for that nitrogen to be lost. Work that Fabian had done when he was at University of Illinois, they were measuring residual soil total inorganic N, and when you looked at the nitrogen that had been applied as part of the ammoniated phosphate in the fall, when you went back in the spring, only a third of that was available. It doesn't necessarily say where it went, but it just means it's not plant available. So it's important to keep in mind with fall-applied ammoniated phosphates that there is a potential for nitrogen loss, and that should be an important consideration both for your nitrogen budget as well as environmental considerations as well. Another thing to keep in mind too, as superphosphates are becoming used potentially increasingly, they're not compatible with urea. That's one thing to call out. So as you're working with a new fertilizer and blending it and storing it, just make sure that you're doing your homework to make sure that you don't end up with a problem. One known compatibility issue is the superphosphates and urea just aren't blendable. They form sort of a concrete type mix. So keep that in mind. In high pH or calcareous soils, there is going to be a difference in how that superphosphate granule diffuses and dissolves. There is a high amount of calcium, about 15% or so, in the superphosphates. And so even though they're acidic granules, in conditions in calcareous soil conditions, there's been research done that's shown that the diffusion of that phosphorus from the granule, that distance is going to be smaller, and it's from this interaction with the calcium that's available in the soil. if you're thinking about applying a superphosphate and maybe a banded application, that might not be as much of an issue, but it could be something to think about for a broadcast application. And it's something that we're studying too as part of field trials to really understand, is there a meaningful agronomic performance difference between the superphosphates and the ammoniated phosphates as you looking across a different set of placements and soil conditions. But that's just a good call out to keep in mind. And another thing I wanted to mention too is seed safety, right? For seed place phosphates, a superphosphate that doesn't have ammonium, that doesn't have nitrogen in it, has the potential, and there's been some great work done at South Dakota State historically. Jason probably has more answers to this than I do, looking at the differences in seed safety across different fertilizer types. And so this is another area of interest for us as you seed place phos with sensitive crops. Is there a meaningful agronomic difference in field trials from an ammoniated phosphate versus a superphosphate? So that's what I had prepared. I think we might have time for a few questions. If not, I'm always happy to take questions later throughout the day too, but thank you very much. Oh yeah.
I'll see if there's any. Okay, do you have any questions in the room? Hi. How are you?
Yeah, thank you. I'm just curious, I see that you produce 1034 and there's a lot of marketing dollars spent promoting what I'll just call premium phosphate starter fertilizers. And they cost producers a lot more money. And I'm just curious if you guys have done any comparisons with the 1034 versus other orthophosphates.
It's a good question. I don't believe that we produce 1034, or at least I don't believe that we market it in North America. Others do, right? It's a commonly used starter fertilizer source. I think there is good research on a starter effect, but I think that could come in a number of different ways, depending on your soil type and the application method that you have. Something that did make it into the presentation that I wanted to include, just didn't have time, is there might be some new biosolutions, let's say, that could provide some of that early season P availability. So there might be multiple ways to achieve the same outcome, but you have to, validate that it's working in your operation. I don't think this is necessarily one size fits all. So I don't know if I really answered your question or not, but it's a good one.
Other questions for Brian? What's the world supply look like right now in terms of longevity?
It's a good question. So I think that depending on how you slice it, the number that we present is over 200 years supply, but all of that is subject to economic conditions, right? So it's economically available. So there are a number of reserves, especially those igneous reserves, in addition to the sedimentary ones. So it just changes as the cost of production fluctuates. But around 200 years is the current best estimate, but it depends on which source. I've heard as high as 500 or 800 or 200. It's a moving target, but that's why we take the stewardship of the resource so seriously, because it's important for the entire world's food security.
Brian, why don't you take that one up on the screen and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay. MAP has been harder to find at retailers in recent years compared to DAP. Could you comment on why is this a trend? So I don't work in our supply chain group. If they were here, they might have an answer for the global trade flows. I do know that the global availability of phosphate and the supply and demand balances in the last few years have become challenging. That's driven up the price of phosphate relative to other fertilizers. And so it's a complex demand, it's a complex market. And so what growers in Brazil are using, or how much China is exporting, or production issues in certain regions can all demand or drive the availability. And depending on where your retailer is located too, some of the products coming on rails, some is coming up through the river system. And so I don't have a specific answer to your question, but maybe just a general one, that this is part of a global trade and supply network. And there could be changes as we go through time too, in terms of the types of phosphates that'll be available in your area. So that's why it's important to keep this agronomic information in mind as you're evaluating the availability of the products you have in your geography.
Brian, you're going to be with us the rest of the day?
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you very much. Excellent.